Marcus had always been his own worst enemy. At 32, he possessed every external marker of success that society demanded: a corner office overlooking the city, a salary that made his parents proud, and an apartment that impressed visitors. Yet every morning, he woke to the same suffocating voice in his head, the endless stream of doubt, criticism, and fear that had become his constant companion since childhood. "You're not smart enough for this presentation," the voice whispered as he prepared for another crucial meeting. "They'll see right through you. Remember what happened last time? The stammering, the blank stares, the way Johnson looked at you like you were incompetent." This internal dialogue wasn't unique to Marcus. Across the globe, millions of people wake each day to find themselves trapped in similar mental prisons, elaborate constructions of self-doubt, limiting beliefs, and psychological barriers that exist nowhere but in the space between their ears. The tragedy isn't that these mental prisons exist, it's that most people never realize they hold the keys to their own freedom. The concept of leaving one's head represents more than simple positive thinking or mindfulness meditation. It speaks to a fundamental shift in how we relate to our own mental processes, a recognition that the voice in our head, however familiar and seemingly authoritative, is not the totality of who we are. This voice, with all its fears and limitations, is simply one aspect of consciousness, and not necessarily the most accurate or helpful one. Dr. Sarah Chan, a cognitive neuroscientist studying the effects of metacognition on performance, had observed this phenomenon repeatedly in her laboratory. Her research subjects, when taught to observe their thoughts rather than identify with them, showed remarkable improvements in everything from creative problem-solving to stress management. "The moment we step back and recognize that we are not our thoughts," she explained to her colleague, "we create space for entirely new possibilities to emerge." The mechanism behind this transformation lies in understanding the difference between the experiencing self and the narrating self. The experiencing self lives in the present moment, responds to immediate stimuli, and operates from a place of direct perception. The narrating self, by contrast, constantly tells stories about what everything means, why things are happening, and what might go wrong. For most people, the narrating self has become dominant, creating an almost constant stream of mental commentary that drowns out direct experience. When Marcus finally learned to distinguish between these two aspects of consciousness, his life began to change in ways he had never thought possible. The technique wasn't complex, it required simply observing his thoughts as if they were clouds passing through the sky of his awareness. Instead of believing every anxious prediction or self-critical comment, he began to notice them with a kind of detached curiosity. Interesting, he would think as his mind began its familiar litany of reasons why he wasn't qualified for his role. There goes the inadequacy story again. I wonder what it's trying to protect me from. This shift in perspective, from being the victim of his thoughts to being the observer of them, created immediate changes in his behavior and effectiveness. During presentations, instead of being paralyzed by imagined criticism, he found himself naturally adapting to his audience's needs. The mental resources previously consumed by self-doubt became available for actual problem-solving and creative thinking. The psychological literature confirms what Marcus experienced personally. Studies in cognitive diffusion show that people who learn to observe their thoughts rather than be controlled by them demonstrate increased psychological flexibility, better emotional regulation, and improved performance across multiple domains. The technique works because it addresses a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of thought itself. Most people operate under the assumption that their thoughts are accurate reflections of reality, that the voice in their head is providing useful information about the world around them. In reality, this internal voice is often outdated, biased, and focused on threats that exist only in imagination. The brain's negativity bias, which evolved to keep our ancestors alive in dangerous environments, now often works against us in modern contexts where perceived threats are largely psychological rather than physical. Elena, a software engineer who had struggled with imposter syndrome throughout her career, discovered this truth during a particularly challenging period at her company. Despite having led multiple successful projects, she found herself paralyzed by the belief that her colleagues would eventually discover she didn't belong in her role. The thought seemed so real, so convincing, that she began avoiding challenging assignments and passing up opportunities for advancement. Everything changed when she encountered the work of researchers studying the phenomenon of cognitive diffusion. She learned that thoughts are not facts, they are simply mental events that arise and pass away like everything else in experience. This realization allowed her to maintain her composure during difficult technical discussions, contribute innovative solutions without second-guessing herself, and eventually accept a promotion to lead architect. The strangest thing, she reflected months later, was realizing that all those fears and doubts were still there sometimes. The difference was that I stopped taking them seriously. They became like background noise rather than the controlling voice of my experience. This transformation illustrates a crucial principle in the psychology of mental liberation. We don't need to eliminate negative thoughts or achieve some state of perpetual positivity. We simply need to change our relationship to our mental content. When we stop identifying with every thought and emotion that arises, we create space for wisdom, creativity, and effective action to emerge naturally. The neuroscience behind this process reveals fascinating insights about brain plasticity and consciousness. When people practice observing their thoughts rather than being consumed by them, neuroimaging studies show increased activity in the prefrontal cortex, the brain region associated with executive function and emotional regulation. Simultaneously, there's decreased reactivity in the amygdala, the brain's alarm system that triggers fight or flight responses. This neurological shift explains why people who master the art of mental observation often report feeling more confident, creative, and capable of handling stress. They're not operating from a fundamentally different brain, they're simply using their existing neural hardware more effectively. David, an emergency room physician, exemplified this principle in his professional life. The nature of his work demanded split-second decisions under extreme pressure, with lives often hanging in the balance. Early in his career, he found himself paralyzed by self-doubt during critical moments. What if I miss something? The voice would whisper. What if this decision is wrong? What if the patient dies because of my incompetence? These thoughts, while understandable given the stakes of his work, actually made him less effective as a physician. His attention was divided between the medical situation at hand and the anxious commentary running in his head. Patient care suffered, and his own stress levels became unsustainable. The transformation came when David learned to treat his thoughts as information rather than truth. During emergencies, he would notice his mind's tendency toward catastrophic thinking and simply acknowledge it. I see the fear thoughts are here. That's normal given the situation. Now, what does the evidence actually tell me about this patient's condition? This subtle shift allowed him to access years of medical training and experience without the interference of psychological noise. His diagnostic accuracy improved, his stress levels decreased, and colleagues began seeking his opinion in difficult cases. The irony wasn't lost on him. By taking his thoughts less seriously, he had become more effective at dealing with genuinely serious situations. The implications of this understanding extend far beyond individual psychology. When people learn to operate from a place of mental freedom rather than mental imprisonment, they naturally become more innovative, collaborative, and resilient. They're able to see opportunities that others miss, take calculated risks that lead to breakthrough results, and maintain their equilibrium in the face of challenges that would derail those still trapped in their heads. Consider the story of Lisa, a marketing executive who had always prided herself on being thorough and careful. These qualities had served her well early in her career, but, as she moved into leadership roles, her tendency toward perfectionism and overthinking began to hold her back. Every campaign proposal went through endless internal revisions as she imagined all the ways it might fail. Team meetings became exercises in second-guessing rather than creative collaboration. The turning point came during a company retreat where she participated in an exercise designed to highlight the difference between thinking about problems and experiencing them directly. Participants were asked to solve a series of puzzles while paying attention to their mental process. Lisa noticed that her best insights came not from thinking harder, but from relaxing her mental grip and allowing solutions to emerge naturally. This experience taught her to distinguish between productive thinking and mental spinning. Productive thinking was focused, time-limited, and directed toward specific outcomes. Mental spinning was the endless loop of worry, second-guessing, and catastrophic thinking that masqueraded as problem-solving but actually prevented effective action. Armed with this understanding, Lisa began approaching her work differently. Instead of endlessly analyzing campaign concepts in her head, she would create quick prototypes and test them with real audiences. Rather than trying to anticipate every possible objection in meetings, she would present ideas confidently and address concerns as they arose. The results were immediate and dramatic. Her campaigns became more innovative, her team became more engaged, and her own stress levels plummeted. The transformation wasn't about becoming less thoughtful or abandoning careful planning. It was about recognizing the difference between useful thinking and mental imprisonment. Useful thinking was like a tool, picked up when needed, used for its intended purpose, and put down when the job was complete. Mental imprisonment was like carrying that tool everywhere, even when it wasn't needed, and especially when it was getting in the way. This distinction becomes particularly important when we consider the role of mental chatter in limiting human potential. Research in sports psychology has consistently shown that athletes perform best when they're in a state of relaxed concentration, fully present to their physical experience without the interference of mental commentary. The same principle applies across virtually every domain of human performance. James, a professional musician, had experienced this truth throughout his career. During his best performances, he would enter a state where his technical training, creative inspiration, and physical execution merged into a seamless whole. There was no voice analyzing his fingering, critiquing his interpretation, or worrying about the audience's reaction. There was simply the music itself, flowing through him without obstruction. The challenge was learning to access this state reliably rather than hoping it would happen spontaneously. Through careful observation, James noticed that his peak performances were always preceded by a subtle shift in his relationship to his thoughts. Instead of fighting with his mind's tendency toward analysis and criticism, he would acknowledge these mental processes while maintaining his focus on the music itself. "I learned to treat my thoughts like sounds from another room," he explained. "They might be happening, but they don't have to interfere with what I'm doing here and now." This metaphor captures something essential about the process of mental liberation. We don't need to eliminate thoughts or achieve some state of mental emptiness. We simply need to recognize that thoughts are voluntary. We can pay attention to them when they're useful and ignore them when they're not. The practical implications of this understanding are profound. When we're no longer at the mercy of every random thought or emotion that arises, we become capable of sustained attention, creative problem solving, and effective action in ways that would have been impossible while trapped in our heads. The world doesn't literally become ours, but our capacity to engage with it effectively expands dramatically. This expansion of capacity often manifests in unexpected ways. People report increased intuition, better timing in their decision-making, and an uncanny ability to say the right thing at the right moment. These aren't mystical phenomena, they're the natural result of accessing information and capabilities that were always present but were previously obscured by mental noise. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a researcher studying flow states and peak performance, had observed this phenomenon across multiple disciplines. When people stop interfering with their own natural intelligence, he noted, they often surprise themselves with what they're capable of. The limitation was never their actual ability, it was their belief about their ability, and their mental habit of second-guessing themselves. This observation points to a crucial aspect of mental liberation. It's not about acquiring new skills or capabilities, but about removing the psychological barriers that prevent us from accessing what we already possess. Every person has experienced moments of effortless competence, times when they knew exactly what to do and did it without hesitation. The goal is not to create these moments from scratch, but to understand what allows them to occur naturally. For most people, these peak experiences happen when their usual mental processes are temporarily suspended during emergencies, in flow states, or in moments of complete absorption in an activity. By learning to suspend mental interference deliberately rather than accidentally, we can access these optimal states more consistently and in a wider range of situations. The key insight is that mental liberation is not a destination but a practice. It's not about reaching some permanent state of enlightenment where negative thoughts never arise, but about developing the skill to relate to our mental content in a more flexible and effective way. Like any skill, it improves with practice and becomes more natural over time. This practical approach to mental freedom stands in contrast to more mystical or esoteric teachings about consciousness and self-realization. While those traditions may contain valuable insights, the path to psychological liberation can be understood and practiced in purely secular, scientific terms. It's about neuroscience and psychology, not metaphysics and spirituality. The evidence for this approach continues to accumulate across multiple fields of research. Cognitive behavioral therapy has long recognized that changing our relationship to our thoughts can transform our emotional experience and behavior. Mindfulness-based interventions have shown remarkable effectiveness in treating everything from anxiety and depression to chronic pain and autoimmune disorders. Performance psychology has demonstrated that athletes, artists, and professionals perform better when they learn to get out of their own way mentally. What all these approaches share is the recognition that our thoughts and emotions, while important aspects of human experience, are not necessarily accurate guides to reality or effective directors of our behavior. By learning to observe our mental processes rather than be controlled by them, we gain access to wisdom, creativity, and effectiveness that our thinking minds alone could never provide. The process of destroying one's weak self is not about violence or self-hatred, it's about the systematic dismantling of psychological patterns that no longer serve us. Every person carries within them multiple versions of themselves: the confident self that emerges in certain situations, the anxious self that dominates in others, the creative self that appears during inspired moments, and the critical self that seems to have an opinion about everything. What most people don't realize is that these various selves are not fixed aspects of personality but learned patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that can be modified or replaced entirely. The weak self is simply the collection of patterns that limit our effectiveness and happiness, patterns that were often adaptive in earlier circumstances but have become obstacles in our current life. Rebecca's story illustrates this process with remarkable clarity. As a child growing up with an alcoholic father, she had developed an acute sensitivity to other people's moods and an instinctive tendency to avoid conflict at all costs. These adaptations had helped her survive a chaotic household, but they were destroying her adult relationships and career prospects. In meetings at her consulting firm, she would notice herself agreeing with opinions she didn't share, staying silent when she had valuable insights to offer, and avoiding the kind of direct communication that was essential for leadership roles. Her colleagues respected her technical skills, but she was consistently passed over for promotions because she seemed to lack the confidence and assertiveness that clients expected from senior consultants. The transformation began when Rebecca stopped seeing these patterns as fixed aspects of her personality and started recognizing them as learned behaviors that could be unlearned. This shift in perspective was itself a form of liberation. Instead of being stuck with traits that felt immutable, she realized she was dealing with habits that could be changed through conscious practice. The first step in this process involved developing what psychologists call metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe our own thinking and behavioral patterns with some degree of objectivity. For Rebecca, this meant noticing in real time when her conflict avoidance programming was activated and making different choices despite the discomfort this initially caused. During one particularly important client presentation, she noticed her familiar tendency to soften her recommendations and hedge her statements with unnecessary qualifiers. Instead of following this pattern automatically, she paused, recognized what was happening, and chose to speak with the directness and confidence that the situation required. The client's positive response was immediate and unmistakable. They wanted to work with someone who believed in their own expertise. This moment marked the beginning of what Rebecca would later describe as the systematic destruction of her weak self. Pattern by pattern, situation by situation, she began choosing responses that aligned with her adult capabilities rather than her childhood survival strategies. The process wasn't comfortable. It felt like stepping off a cliff every time she spoke up in meetings or disagreed with a superior, but the results were undeniable. Within 2 years, she had been promoted to senior consultant and was leading her own team. More importantly, she had developed a sense of personal authority that extended beyond her professional life. Friends and family noticed that she seemed more present, more authentic, and more capable of standing up for herself and others when the situation called for it. The psychology behind this transformation reveals important insights about the nature of personality and behavioral change. What we typically think of as fixed character traits are often simply well-rehearsed patterns of response that have become automatic through repetition. When we develop the ability to observe these patterns consciously, we create the possibility of choosing different responses and, over time, developing different patterns entirely. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a specialist in trauma-informed therapy, had observed this process repeatedly in her practice. People are often amazed to discover that the personality traits they thought were unchangeable are actually just very old habits, she explained to her graduate students. Once someone realizes they're not stuck with their current patterns, the question becomes, what patterns would better serve them now? This question gets to the heart of constructive self-destruction. We're not trying to eliminate aspects of ourselves arbitrarily, but to identify and replace patterns that are preventing us from living effectively in our current circumstances. The goal is not to become someone else entirely, but to become the fullest expression of who we actually are when we're not limited by outdated psychological programming. The process often involves confronting aspects of our identity that feel fundamental but are actually constructed. Many people, for example, identify strongly with their tendency toward worry, their perfectionism, or their people-pleasing behaviors. They may even see these traits as virtues that distinguish them from others. The recognition that these patterns are choices rather than fixed aspects of personality can be both liberating and disorienting. Thomas had always prided himself on being a worrier. In his family, anxiety was seen as a sign of caring and responsibility. People who didn't worry about everything that could go wrong were viewed as naive or irresponsible. This belief system had shaped his entire approach to life. He planned obsessively, imagined worst-case scenarios constantly, and felt guilty whenever he experienced moments of genuine relaxation. By his 40s, Thomas had achieved considerable success as a financial planner, largely because his clients appreciated his meticulous attention to potential risks and contingencies. However, his personal life was suffering. His wife complained that he couldn't enjoy vacations because he was always worried about what might be going wrong at home or at work. His children had learned to avoid telling him about their plans because his immediate response was always a litany of concerns and warnings. The wake-up call came during a family vacation when his teenage daughter asked him directly, "Dad, do you ever just enjoy anything? You always seem stressed about something." This question forced Thomas to examine whether his identity as a worrier was actually serving him or anyone else. He began to distinguish between appropriate caution and chronic anxiety, between genuine problem-solving and mental spinning. What he discovered was that most of his worry was not only unproductive, it was actively interfering with his ability to think clearly and respond effectively when real challenges arose. The process of dismantling his worry-based identity was gradual and required constant vigilance. Every time his mind began its familiar catastrophic spiral, he would pause and ask himself, "Is this worry helping me solve an actual problem, or is it just mental noise?" If it wasn't contributing to a solution, he would consciously redirect his attention to the present moment. The results were transformative. His decision-making actually improved as he learned to gather information and make choices without the interference of anxious overthinking. His relationships deepened as he became more present and enjoyable to be around. Perhaps most surprisingly, his professional effectiveness increased as clients began to see him as a calm, confident advisor rather than a fellow worrier. Thomas's experience illustrates a crucial principle in the destruction of limiting patterns. We don't eliminate these patterns by fighting them directly, but by starving them of attention and energy while simultaneously cultivating more effective responses. The old patterns may continue to arise. Thoughts and emotions have their own momentum, but they lose their power to control our behavior when we stop identifying with them. This approach differs significantly from traditional methods of behavior change that focus on willpower and self-discipline. Instead of trying to force ourselves to be different, we simply observe our current patterns without judgment and make conscious choices about which ones deserve our attention and energy. The patterns we feed with attention grow stronger, those we ignore gradually weaken and fade. Dr. Alan Petrov, a researcher studying neuroplasticity and behavioral change, had documented this process in numerous studies. The brain is constantly reorganizing itself based on what we pay attention to, he noted. When we consistently choose to focus on effective thoughts and behaviors rather than limiting ones, we literally rewire our neural networks. The old patterns don't disappear overnight, but they become less and less influential over time. This neuroplasticity is what makes genuine personality change possible at any age. The patterns that seem most fixed and immutable are often just the ones we've practiced most consistently. By bringing conscious awareness to our automatic responses and choosing different actions despite our habitual impulses, we can literally reshape our brains and, consequently, our lived experience. The process requires patience and persistence because we're working against years or decades of conditioning. However, the changes often begin to manifest surprisingly quickly once we commit to the practice seriously. People frequently report noticeable improvements in their confidence, clarity, and effectiveness within weeks of beginning to observe and modify their mental patterns. Maria, a graphic designer who had struggled with creative blocks and self-doubt throughout her career, experienced this rapid transformation when she stopped identifying with her inner critic. For years, every project had been accompanied by a constant stream of self-deprecating commentary: "This isn't original enough. The client will hate it. Everyone will see that you're not really talented." These thoughts had become so familiar that Maria had stopped questioning their accuracy or usefulness. She simply accepted them as the price of being a conscientious artist. However, when she began observing these thoughts as temporary mental events rather than authoritative assessments of her work, everything changed. During her next project, instead of getting lost in self-critical thoughts, she would notice them and respond with gentle curiosity: "I see the critic is here again. What's it trying to protect me from? What if I just focused on the work itself instead of the commentary about the work?" This simple shift in perspective unleashed a level of creativity and confidence that surprised both Maria and her clients. Without the constant interference of self-doubt, she could access her years of training and experience more directly. Her designs became more bold and innovative, her client relationships improved as she presented her work with greater conviction, and her own satisfaction with her career increased dramatically. The key insight from Maria's experience is that the voice of the inner critic, however familiar and seemingly protective, is not actually helping us do better work. In most cases, it's actively interfering with our natural capabilities. By learning to recognize this voice as one mental process among many rather than the voice of truth or wisdom, we free ourselves to access more reliable sources of guidance. This principle applies across virtually every domain where people struggle with self-limitation. The perfectionist who never completes projects because they're never good enough. The people pleaser who burns out trying to meet everyone else's needs while neglecting their own. The pessimist who talks themselves out of opportunities before even trying. In each case, the pattern that seems protective or virtuous is actually creating the problems it claims to solve. The destruction of these limiting patterns is not a violent or traumatic process when approached skillfully. It's more like pruning a garden, removing growth that's blocking light and nutrients from reaching the plants we want to flourish. The goal is not to create a barren landscape, but to allow our natural capabilities to express themselves without obstruction. This organic approach to change often feels counterintuitive to people who have been taught that personal growth requires struggle and self-discipline. However, research consistently shows that sustainable change happens most readily when we work with our natural psychological processes rather than against them. Force and willpower may create temporary changes, but they rarely lead to lasting transformation. The alternative is to recognize that beneath all our limiting patterns lies an intact capacity for wisdom, creativity, and effective action. This capacity doesn't need to be developed from scratch, it needs to be uncovered and allowed to function naturally. The weak self that we're destroying is not our true nature, but rather the collection of fears, doubts, and limiting beliefs that obscure our true nature. When we understand this distinction, the process of change becomes less about becoming someone new and more about removing the obstacles that prevent us from expressing who we actually are. This reframe makes the work both easier and more sustainable because we're aligning with our deeper nature rather than fighting against it. The transformation typically happens gradually at first, then accelerates as new patterns become established. People often describe a tipping point where their new way of being stops feeling like an effort and starts feeling natural. At this stage, the old limiting patterns may still arise occasionally, but they no longer have the power to derail effective action or create emotional distress. This is the state that ancient philosophers and modern psychologists alike have recognized as psychological freedom, not the absence of difficult thoughts and emotions, but the ability to respond to them skillfully. When we reach this level of mental flexibility, we discover that we're far more capable, creative, and resilient than we ever imagined while we were trapped in our limiting patterns. The implications of this understanding extend beyond individual psychology to encompass leadership, relationships, and creative endeavor. People who have learned to operate from their essential capabilities rather than their limiting patterns naturally become more effective in all areas of life. They inspire confidence in others because they're operating from a place of genuine confidence in themselves. They solve problems more elegantly because they're not handicapped by self-doubt and overthinking. They build stronger relationships because they're present and authentic rather than defensive and reactive. Most importantly, they become essentially indestructible in the psychological sense. When someone is no longer identified with their fears, doubts, and limiting beliefs, there's nothing for outside criticism or pressure to attack. They can receive feedback without becoming defensive, face challenges without being overwhelmed, and pursue their goals without being paralyzed by the possibility of failure. The moment a person stops deriving their sense of self-worth from external sources, something remarkable happens: they become psychologically invulnerable. This doesn't mean they stop caring about other people's opinions or become callously indifferent to feedback. Rather, they develop the capacity to receive input from their environment without having their core sense of identity threatened or inflated by what they hear. Dr. Patricia Hoffman had observed this phenomenon throughout her decades as a clinical psychologist, but she understood it most deeply through her own experience. Early in her career, she had been devastated by any criticism of her work, regardless of its validity or the credibility of its source. A dismissive comment from a colleague could ruin her entire week. A patient's lack of progress felt like a personal indictment of her competence. She lived in constant fear of being exposed as inadequate, despite having graduated at the top of her class and completed prestigious internships. The turning point came during a particularly difficult case where a teenage client challenged everything Patricia thought she knew about therapeutic intervention. "You're just like all the other therapists," the young woman had said during a session. "You think you know what's best for me, but you don't know anything about my life. You're just trying to make yourself feel important." Instead of becoming defensive or trying to convince the client otherwise, Patricia found herself genuinely curious about this feedback. What if there was some truth in it? What if her need to be seen as helpful and competent was actually interfering with her ability to be genuinely helpful? This question led to a period of deep self-examination that transformed not only Patricia's therapeutic approach but her entire relationship with her professional identity. She began to notice how much energy she had been spending on managing other people's perceptions of her competence rather than simply focusing on being competent. The irony was striking: her preoccupation with appearing effective was making her less effective. As she learned to derive her sense of professional worth from her actual contribution to her clients' well-being rather than from their opinions of her, Patricia's therapeutic skills improved dramatically. She became more present in sessions, more willing to acknowledge uncertainty, and more capable of following her client's lead rather than imposing her own agenda. The results spoke for themselves: her success rate improved, her relationships with colleagues became more collaborative, and her own satisfaction with her work deepened significantly. This transformation illustrates a fundamental principle of psychological invulnerability: when we stop needing to be right, perfect, or universally approved of, we become capable of learning, growing, and adapting in ways that were impossible when our ego was constantly on the defensive. The energy previously consumed by protecting our self-image becomes available for actual competence and contribution. The concept of destroying one's weak self in order to become indestructible by others operates on this principle. The weak self is not our essential nature but, rather, our collection of insecurities, defense mechanisms, and approval-seeking behaviors. These patterns, while understandable and often adaptive in their original context, create vulnerabilities that others can exploit and dependencies that others can manipulate. Consider the case of Robert, a successful entrepreneur who had built a multi-million-dollar company but lived in constant fear of being exposed as a fraud. Despite objective evidence of his business acumen, profitable operations, satisfied customers, respected industry position, he was haunted by the belief that his success was due to luck rather than skill. This imposter syndrome made him vulnerable to manipulation by employees, partners, and competitors who sensed his insecurity. During negotiations, Robert would often accept unfavorable terms because he feared that pushing back would reveal his supposed incompetence. In meetings, he would defer to others' expertise even in areas where his own experience was superior. Most damaging of all, he avoided taking the kinds of calculated risks that had originally built his business because he couldn't bear the possibility of failure confirming his deepest fears about himself. The transformation began when Robert started examining the actual evidence for his beliefs about his competence. What he discovered was that his track record of successful decisions far outweighed his failures, that his industry knowledge was genuinely extensive, and that his business instincts were consistently reliable. The imposter syndrome wasn't based on reality, it was based on outdated programming from childhood experiences of being criticized and dismissed. Once Robert recognized that his self-doubt was not an accurate assessment of his capabilities, he began conducting himself with the confidence that his actual track record justified. The changes were immediate and dramatic. In negotiations, he became appropriately assertive about his company's value. In strategic discussions, he trusted his own judgment while remaining open to input from others. Most importantly, he began taking the kinds of strategic risks that allowed his business to expand into new markets and increase profitability. The psychological invulnerability that Robert developed wasn't about becoming arrogant or dismissive of others' opinions. It was about developing an internal sense of worth that wasn't dependent on external validation. When someone criticized his decisions, he could evaluate the feedback on its merits without feeling personally attacked. When someone praised his work, he could appreciate the recognition without needing it for his sense of self-worth. This internal stability created what psychologists call authentic confidence, confidence based on accurate self-assessment rather than defensive posturing or neediness for approval. People with authentic confidence are paradoxically easier to work with because they're not constantly trying to prove themselves or protect their image. They can admit mistakes without feeling devastated, accept feedback without becoming defensive, and celebrate others' successes without feeling diminished. The neuroscience behind this transformation reveals fascinating insights about the brain's threat detection systems. When people operate from a place of psychological insecurity, their amygdala, the brain's alarm system, is chronically activated by perceived social threats. Comments that could be interpreted as criticism, situations that might reveal inadequacy, and comparisons that might suggest inferiority all trigger stress responses that interfere with clear thinking and effective action. Dr. Michael Torres, a neuroscientist studying social threat perception, had documented these effects in laboratory studies. When people feel their social status or competence is under threat, he explained, their cognitive resources become focused on threat assessment rather than problem solving. They're literally less intelligent in these situations because their brain is prioritizing survival over thinking. This finding explains why insecure people often perform below their actual capabilities in high-stakes situations. Their mental resources are divided between the task at hand and monitoring for threats to their self-image. By contrast, people who have developed psychological invulnerability can devote their full cognitive capacity to whatever they're trying to accomplish. The practical implications of this understanding are profound. In leadership roles, psychologically secure individuals make better decisions because they're not distorted by ego concerns. They can acknowledge when they don't know something and seek appropriate expertise. They can change course when evidence suggests their initial approach was flawed. They can give honest feedback to subordinates without worrying about being liked, and they can receive feedback from subordinates without feeling threatened. Sarah, a hospital administrator who had worked her way up from nursing, exemplified these principles in her management style. Early in her administrative career, she had been insecure about her authority and constantly worried that her nursing background made her less qualified than administrators with business degrees. This insecurity had led to micromanaging, defensive decision-making, and an inability to delegate effectively. Everything changed when Sarah stopped comparing herself to others and started focusing on the unique strengths she brought to her role. Her clinical experience gave her credibility with medical staff that pure business administrators often lacked. Her understanding of patient care helped her make decisions that balanced financial constraints with quality outcomes. Her background in crisis management prepared her to handle the kind of emergency situations that hospitals routinely face. Once Sarah began operating from a place of genuine confidence in her abilities rather than defensive insecurity about her background, her effectiveness as a leader improved dramatically. Staff members began coming to her with problems rather than avoiding her. Physicians started seeking her input on operational issues. Board members increasingly relied on her strategic thinking rather than questioning her qualifications. Most importantly, Sarah discovered that she could handle criticism, setbacks, and challenges without having her sense of professional identity shaken. When a particularly difficult surgeon publicly questioned her decision about surgical scheduling, she was able to engage with his concerns professionally without feeling personally attacked. When a cost-cutting initiative she had championed proved unsuccessful, she could acknowledge the failure and implement corrections without experiencing the shame and self-doubt that would have paralyzed her earlier in her career. This kind of psychological resilience isn't about becoming emotionally numb or indifferent to outcomes. Sarah still cared deeply about her work and felt disappointment when things didn't go as planned. The difference was that temporary setbacks no longer threatened her core sense of competence and worth. She could experience failure without becoming a failure, face criticism without being devastated, and encounter challenges without being overwhelmed. The development of this kind of resilience often involves confronting and dismantling the stories we tell ourselves about what our successes and failures mean about us as people. Most of us have learned to interpret external events as evidence for deep truths about our character, intelligence, or worth. A failed project becomes proof that we're incompetent. A successful outcome becomes validation that we're valuable. A critical comment becomes confirmation that we're inadequate. These interpretive habits create enormous psychological vulnerability because they make our sense of self-worth dependent on factors largely outside our control. Other people's opinions, market conditions, organizational changes, and countless other variables become threats to our fundamental sense of okayness. We find ourselves constantly managing our image, avoiding risks, and trying to control outcomes in order to maintain our psychological equilibrium. The alternative is to recognize that external events are simply external events, they don't define who we are or determine our intrinsic worth. This perspective allows us to engage fully with life's challenges and opportunities without the constant background anxiety about what outcomes might mean about us personally. Dr. Elizabeth Martinez, a performance psychologist working with Olympic athletes, had seen this principle demonstrated repeatedly in sports. Athletes who tied their self-worth to their performance results were paradoxically more likely to underperform in crucial moments. The pressure to validate their identity through their results created tension and anxiety that interfered with the relaxed concentration necessary for peak performance. By contrast, athletes who had learned to separate their sense of self from their competitive results often performed better precisely because they were free to focus entirely on execution rather than outcome. They could take appropriate risks, adapt to unexpected circumstances, and maintain their composure under pressure because their fundamental sense of okayness wasn't riding on the result. This same principle applies across every domain of human endeavor. Business executives who don't need to be right all the time make better strategic decisions. Artists who aren't trying to prove their worth through their work create more authentic and compelling art. Students who aren't performing for external validation learn more effectively and enjoyably. The transformation from psychological vulnerability to psychological invulnerability typically happens gradually, but the effects often become apparent quite quickly. People notice that they're less reactive to criticism, less dependent on praise, and less anxious about outcomes they can't control. They find themselves taking more appropriate risks, speaking up more authentically, and generally engaging with life more fully. Perhaps most importantly, they discover that when they stop trying to control other people's perceptions of them, they often end up earning more genuine respect and trust. People are naturally drawn to individuals who seem comfortable in their own skin and don't need constant validation. The paradox is that by caring less about being liked, people often become more likable. This psychological freedom creates a positive feedback loop. As people become less defensive and more authentic, their relationships improve. As their relationships improve, they receive more genuine support and feedback. As they receive better feedback, they continue to grow and develop. The cycle of insecurity and defensive behavior is replaced by a cycle of growth and authentic connection. The end point of this process isn't perfect self-confidence or complete immunity to emotional pain. It's the development of psychological flexibility, the ability to experience the full range of human emotions and challenges without being destabilized by them. People who have achieved this kind of mental freedom can feel hurt without being devastated, face uncertainty without being paralyzed, and encounter criticism without being defensive. They understand that thoughts and emotions are temporary experiences that don't define their essential nature. They can acknowledge their limitations without feeling ashamed, celebrate their strengths without becoming arrogant, and face challenges without being overwhelmed. Most importantly, they can pursue their goals and express their values without being constantly distracted by concerns about how they're being perceived by others. This is the true meaning of becoming indestructible, not that nothing can hurt us, but that nothing can destroy the essential core of who we are. When we stop identifying with our fears, insecurities, and limiting beliefs, there's nothing left for external circumstances to threaten. We become like water, able to flow around obstacles rather than being stopped by them. The practical benefits of this psychological state extend into every area of life. Relationships become deeper and more satisfying because we're no longer performing for others' approval. Work becomes more fulfilling because we're focused on contribution rather than validation. Challenges become opportunities for growth rather than threats to our self-image. Life becomes an adventure to be lived fully rather than a test to be passed. This transformation doesn't require years of therapy or meditation, though those practices can certainly be helpful. It simply requires the willingness to question our assumptions about what external events mean about us and to experiment with relating to our thoughts and emotions as temporary experiences rather than fundamental truths. When we make this shift, we discover that the freedom we've been seeking was always available, we just needed to stop imprisoning ourselves with our own thoughts and stories. The world becomes ours not because we conquer it, but because we stop being afraid of it. When we're no longer defending against imaginary threats or performing for imaginary audiences, we can engage with reality as it actually is rather than as our fears and insecurities project it to be. This is the ultimate liberation, the freedom to be ourselves fully and respond to life authentically, regardless of what others might think or say about us.